Well, I tried to come up with a story or an illustration to introduce our study today, as I normally do. But nothing worked. There was nothing that was good enough. Every idea just seemed to fall short. I mean, I thought of someone celebrating a sports team's victory or celebrating the win of an election, and that just seemed too shallow. I thought about a proposal, and she said yes. And I thought, well, that's exciting, but it didn't capture the full picture. It was missing the negative aspect of what our passage is going to say. Probably the best idea was someone who was waiting to hear from the doctor about the test results, and then finds out there's no cancer. You see, what we'll read today, it does have elements of danger and relief and joy. But it's even more than that. You see, Zephaniah will tell us of two extremes. On one, you have the absolute worst thing that could happen to you. And the other is the absolute best thing that could happen, that you could experience. There is nothing worse than God's judgment. And there is nothing better than God's deliverance and his being present with us forever. But some people will experience the worst. But some will escape the worst and be given the best. And so today we begin in the book of Zephaniah, chapter 1 and verse 1. It says, the word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. And so in Zephaniah's introduction here, we have this little genealogy that goes back 4 generations. Now that's longer than most of the other prophets that were told of the other prophets. But there's a reason for it here. You see, Zephaniah is from the royal family. He's the great-great-grandson of the good king Hezekiah, which tells us that he has a good heritage, and it means that he has access to the king and could take God's message to the king. And so this king at this time is Josiah, who we talked about last week, and who followed God and carried out many reforms in Judah and Israel. Now, before we move on in Zephaniah, we should note one thing about Zephaniah's prophecy. He prophesies about the day of the Lord, the time when God comes in judgment. And we've said this before, but there are several occasions that are referred to as the day of the Lord in the Bible. Now, throughout Zephaniah's prophecy, he will speak of judgment against Judah and Jerusalem specifically. He will of judgment against the nations or Gentiles specifically, and against all sinners. And at times he will speak of the near judgment, the things that will happen soon, closer to his time, of Judah and going into exile, and of God judging the enemies who oppress Judah and Israel. But he will also speak of the great final judgment. But these two ideas are intermingled. The near and the far, they're intermingled, and they kind of flow together because the earlier foreshadows the later universal judgment. So let's keep reading in chapter 1, verse 2. God says, I will utterly sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. I will sweep away man and beast. I will sweep away birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea and the rubble with the wicked. I will cut off mankind from the face of the earth, declares the Lord. So first, we see that this judgment is from God, and it is certain, and it is thorough. Okay, we're told that God declares this, and then he goes on and says, I will, I will, I will, I will. And notice the strong words. He says that he will utterly sweep away everything. And then these details that are given emphasize this. It says that he will sweep away everything from the face of the earth, and he will cut off mankind from the face of the earth. You know what this sounds like? This sounds like the flood during Noah's time, right? He's using the same words, the same phrases that were used to describe the judgment of the flood of the entire earth. And so the entire earth will be judged again. Secondly, he says that he will sweep away man and beast and birds and fish. Does this sound familiar? This is the reverse order of creation. You see, this pictures an undoing of creation. And so nothing will be left unaffected. Thirdly, he says that he'll sweep away the rubble with the wicked. Now, this word rubble could be understood as stumbling blocks and referring to the idols that the wicked people are worshiping and have used to turn away from God. Or it could be understood as ruins. And then it would be referring to the destroyed cities of the wicked. But either way, the point is clear. God is coming against the wicked, and there will be great destruction. And so what's being said in all of this is that everything sinful in the entire earth, everything that is opposed to God, will be completely wiped away. Verse 4. He says, I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off from this place the remnant of Baal and the name of the idolatrous priests along with the priests, those who bow down on the roofs to the hosts of the heavens, those who bow down and swear to the Lord and yet swear to Milcom, those who have turned back from following the Lord, who do not seek the Lord or inquire of him. So now he focuses in on Judah and God's covenant people who have been given special revelation of God and a special relationship with God through the covenant, but who have rejected God and refused to obey him and follow false gods instead. And now God says he will punish them for their sins. So first, he calls out those who worship Baal and those who worship the sun and the moon and the stars. By the way, notice he says the remnant of Baal. This may suggest to us that this prophecy of Zephaniah was given after Josiah had begun his reforms in Judah. And so Baal, even after the Baal idols were removed, some people are still persisting in this evil practice. There's a remnant of Baal. Well, then he brings attention to those who swear to the Lord and yet swear by Milcom, a false god. And so these are people who worship God and other false gods. Their loyalty is divided, and they would probably claim to be faithful to God because they're worshiping him. But because they're giving themselves to other gods, to idols, they're not. You see, God, Yahweh, alone is God. There is no other. And God told them not to worship any other, not to worship any false gods. And so their so-called worship of God, of Yahweh, is not true worship at all. And then God goes on to call out those who have simply turned away from him. They don't follow him. They don't seek him or consult him about life. These are people who are indifferent to God, and they have no real relationship with him, and they've rejected him as God. But because of all these things, God says he will stretch out his hand and will remove them from the land. Now, have you ever had someone raise a fist to you? Maybe someone who was bigger and stronger than you raise a fist to you? I have. And it's not a fun situation to be in. It's scary. This is the feeling here. God is going to stretch out his hand. Divine judgment is coming against Judah. Verse 7. Be silent before the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is near. The Lord has prepared a sacrifice and consecrated his guests. And on the day of the Lord's sacrifice, I will punish the officials and the king's sons, and all who array themselves in foreign attire. On that day, I will punish everyone who leaps over the threshold, and those who fill their master's house with violence and fraud. And so at this point, Zephaniah calls on the people to be silent before God. Now, this is the only appropriate response to God and to the coming judgment. Just stand there silent with your attention on God. Because the day of the Lord, the day when God comes to judge his enemies, is coming soon. But then Zephaniah uses this metaphor of a sacrifice to describe the coming judgment. This is interesting. See, with some of the sacrifices that were offered to God in Old Testament times, the animal was brought and the animal was killed, was sacrificed, but then certain parts of the animal were then burnt as an offering to God, and then the rest of the animal, the meat of the animal, was then eaten by the people as an act of worship. And so it was like the people were offering the sacrifice, and then they were eating a meal in fellowship with God. And so this meal was then a fellowship with God, so you could call them his guests. And before the sacrifice and the meal, though, the people would first have to be consecrated or cleansed or set apart. All right, so let's apply this picture. This is the picture being used here. Judah is the sacrifice. In other words, they will be killed, put to death, judged. And God has consecrated or set apart someone to sacrifice or destroy them. This refers to the Babylonians who will come, who God is sending to conquer them. And God then goes on and he specifically calls out the leaders of Judah and the royalty for dressing like foreigners. Now, this could be referring to dressing up for idol worship, but it's probably more general than that. These leaders are dressing like people from other nations because they want to be like those people. But God has called them to be distinct, to be different. They are to be his people. And so this isn't just about clothes. The clothes are an illustration of where their heart is. He also takes issue with those who leap over the threshold. Now, the meaning of this is uncertain. It may refer to a pagan ritual or to superstition, like people say, don't step on a crack, kind of thing. It could be just a superstition, or it may tie in with the next phrase, referring to those who rush in and out of their houses, eager to make money dishonestly. Well, let's keep reading verse 10. He says, on that day, declares the Lord, a cry will be heard from the fish gate, a wail from the second quarter, a loud crash from the hills. Wail, O inhabitants of the mortar, for the traders are no more. All who weigh out silver are cut off. At that time, I will search Jerusalem with lamps. I will punish the men who are complacent, those who say in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do ill. The goods shall be plundered and their houses laid waste. Though they build houses, they shall not inhabit them. Though they plant vineyards, they shall not drink wine from them. Okay, so all over Jerusalem, people will be crying out because they're experiencing financial ruin. And God is pictured here as shining a light into all the dark corners, searching for people who deserve punishment. I mean, who are these people? Well, he calls them the complacent, Or this word is also translated as the stagnant or the settled or those who are entrenched in sin. In other words, these are people who are comfortable with their sin. Comfortable in their sinful lives, and they're apathetic towards God. But not only that, they also think that God is apathetic too, that he doesn't care. They think that God doesn't care about what happens here in this world or in our lives, that he isn't active in people's lives. We call these people today agnostics, and they're being called out here. But they think that because God isn't involved in our world or care about what they do, they think it doesn't matter how they live. And they aren't willing to obey God. They just don't care about God. And they live their lives without giving him any thought. And it says that they will lose everything they have when they're overrun by their enemy that God is sending to judge them. Now, this is a sad statement, but the last sentence of verse 3 talks about them building houses and not living in them, planting vineyards, not drinking of their wine. That last sentence is the opposite of what God told Israel before they came into the land. I'm going to read you what God said. Back in Deuteronomy 6, verses 10 to 12, Moses writes, "And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." But after being blessed by God, they forgot the Lord. They did exactly what Moses said, be careful not to do. They forgot the Lord, and now they will be removed from the land. And the thing is, they knew this could happen because it was part of the covenant. This was part of the curses that were promised if they didn't obey God from the covenant. In Deuteronomy 28:30, it says, "You shall build a house, but you shall not dwell in it. You shall plant a vineyard, but you shall not enjoy its fruit." You see, God is keeping his promises. They could have had it great, or they could lose it all. Their choices and their actions have brought on what's coming to them. Verse 14. "The great day of the Lord is near, near and hastening fast. The sound of the day of the Lord is bitter. The mighty man cries aloud there. A day of wrath is that day, a day of distress and anguish, a day of ruin and devastation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet blasts and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the lofty battlements. I will bring distress on mankind, so that they shall walk like the blind, because they have sinned against the Lord. Their blood shall be poured out like dust, and their flesh like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them on the day of the wrath of the Lord, in the fire of his jealousy, and all the earth shall be consumed. For a full and sudden end he will make all the inhabitants of the earth." He's saying it's coming soon. They've been warned for many years about this, but it won't be long now. And it will be a bitter day. I mean, the negative descriptive words are just piled up in these verses here. He says it's a time when the strong men will cry. A time of wrath and distress and anguish. A time of ruin and devastation. And a time of darkness and gloom. And a time of battle. It'll be a time of punishment for sin. God is doing this because people have sinned against him. And when God's judgment comes, both against Judah and later against all the earth, God will cause sinners to trip around in distress as if they were blind, like they can't see where they're going. In other words, it won't be good. And he says there will be blood everywhere, like dust is everywhere. And he says in their flesh, that is their intestines, will be scattered around like manure. Now, this is a graphic picture of their coming death. But it has a purpose here. Those who hear this should not take it lightly. It will be terrible, and there will be no escape for sinners, for these sinners. People need to know that God has wrath. His anger burns against sin. And God is jealous. He is passionate about being honored as he rightly deserves. In fact, in Isaiah 42:8, he says, I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images. And so his judgment is coming like fire, and he will destroy all the sinful people of the world. Well, let's keep reading. Chapter 2, verse 1. He says, gather together, yes, gather, O shameless nation, before the decrees take effect, before the day passes away like chaff, before there comes upon you the burning anger of the Lord, before there comes upon you the day of the anger of the Lord. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, who do his just commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you may be hidden on the day of the anger of the Lord. So Zephaniah is giving a warning and a challenge here. First, speaking to the sinful who have turned away from God, they are told to gather together. They will be like a bunch of kindling that's gathered together and starts a fire, ignites a fire in fire. Zephaniah is telling them to get ready to be judged by God for their sin. But then he speaks to the humble. The humble are those who listen to God and who submit to him and obey him. And they are told to seek the Lord. They are to truly follow God, to repent of their sin and live right in obedience and submission to God. Well, then Zephaniah says something a little surprising, though. It's surprising because he uses the word perhaps. He says that the humble who seek God might be hidden or protected on the day of God's anger. Why perhaps? Well, this may be rhetorical, expressing the idea that, well, if the righteous might be delivered, well, then the unrighteous definitely won't be. Or it may be a realistic statement of the possibility of collateral damage. See, although they are faithful and will be spared God's wrath, they live in the midst of unrighteous people. And they may suffer some of the effects of judgment on those unrighteous people. For example, if the city they live in falls to an enemy, the righteous may not make it out totally unscathed. Or he might say perhaps it may just simply be a statement reminding God's people not to take his grace for granted as if it's cheap, but to truly seek him and to trust in him. But the overall point is clear. God's judgment is coming against sinful humanity. It will be severe, and it will be inescapable. So get right with God. Seek him, obey him, follow him, and be faithful. Well, in the rest of chapter 2, Zephaniah moves on to the judgment of the nations. I'm not going to take the time to read it, but he mentions people in each direction from Israel and to the north, east, south, and west. And they represent all of Gentiles. And judgment for their sins will come upon all people. So first he tells of the Philistines to the west, and he mentions the cities of Gaza and Ashkelon. They will be judged. This densely populated area will become open land where flocks will graze, and the land will be settled by the remnant of Judah. Now, This is important. Here in the middle of talking about judgment, when judgment is being declared, there's a statement about the remnant. The group of people who are still faithful to God. God won't forget them, but he will preserve and bless them. And so back in verse 3, Zephaniah said, well, perhaps the faithful will be kept safe. But here we have this definite statement, a statement, it's certain that God will restore and be faithful to the remnant, to those who are faithful to him. Well, then in verses 8 through 11, he tells us about Moab and Ammon to the east, and says they will be judged. The Moabites and the Ammonites had mocked Judah and had opposed them often, and now God will judge them, and they will become a wasteland and be plundered by the remnant of Judah. And they're compared to Sodom and Gomorrah, which is fitting because they are the descendants of Lot, who was rescued from Sodom and Gomorrah when God judged those cities for their wickedness. But now these descendants of Lot will be judged for their own wickedness. And God will exhibit his awesome power and show the complete impotence of all the false gods on the earth. And then he says, and all people of the earth, of every nation, will acknowledge God for who he is. And then in verse 12, he speaks of Cush to the south of Judah. They will be judged. Cush is actually modern-day Ethiopia, but here it's most likely referring to Egypt, that whole area. And he says that they will experience judgment through war. And then lastly, in verses 13 to 15, he tells of Assyria to the north. They will be judged. Their capital, Nineveh, will be destroyed and will become a wasteland where wild animals live and herds graze. They had arrogantly exalted themselves, but they will be brought low. And so in all of this, God is saying that the sinful people of all the earth will receive the judgment that they deserve. Well, then he continues on. Look at chapter 3 and verse 1. He says, woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the oppressing city. She listens to no voice. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. So now Zephaniah turns again to Judah, but he zeroes in on Jerusalem. He says they're in big trouble because of their rebellious and unclean, because they are rebellious and unclean, and because they oppress people and don't listen to God. They reject the prophets and they refuse to get right with God and obey him. They don't trust in God or live in fellowship with him. They don't live like God's people, but instead they completely ignore him. Verse 3. He says, her officials within Jerusalem, are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves that leave nothing till the morning. In other words, they eat everything. Her prophets are fickle, treacherous men. Her priests profane what is holy. They do violence to the law. The Lord within her is righteous. He does no injustice. Every morning he shows forth his justice. Each dawn he does not fail. But the unjust knows no shame. You see, Zephaniah is showing the contrast here between God and his people, his covenant people. Judah's leaders are like wild animals that tear people apart and oppress people and hurt people rather than leading and helping. They promote injustice rather than justice. And then he talks about the prophets. The prophets are compromise the truth, and they say whatever they want to rather than standing firm and proclaiming God's word. He says that they are treacherous, and they're treacherous because people should be able to trust them, but they are actually deceiving and misleading those people. Then he talks about the priests. The priests, they are responsible to represent God in holiness and to perform the sacrifices for the people and to teach God's law. But they are actually breaking the law and disobedient to God, and they pollute the sacrifices with their sin, and they defile God's temple. But God is perfect. He's perfectly just. He does what is right, never does injustice. And this is always true. He is always good. Every day, he is good. And it's clear to see every morning. But sinful people don't take notice. They don't notice it. They just continue in their sinful ways without thinking anything of it. Verse 6. I have cut off nations. Their battlements are in ruins. I have laid waste their streets so that no one walks in them. Their cities have been made desolate, without a man, without an inhabitant. I said, surely you will fear me. You will accept correction. Then your dwelling would not be cut off according to all that I have appointed against you. But all the more they were eager to make their deeds corrupt. So when the nations were devastated by God's judgment, it should have made an impact on God's people, on Judah, on his own people. They should have seen that, and it should have impacted them. They should have taken notice of it and recognized that God is just and that he demands justice, and then that he judges the guilty. They should have repented. If they had, then none of these judgments would have come upon them. They would have been spared judgment, but they didn't. They kept running against God, and they were still eager to sin. Verse 8, therefore, wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day when I rise up to seize the prey, for my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out upon them my indignation, all my burning anger, for in the fire of my jealousy all the earth shall be consumed. This verse starts with the word therefore. And so, in other words, it's looking back at that judgment that was just talked about. Because God's judgment is coming, he says, wait. God says to wait for him. Now, he could be saying this to sinful people like, oh, just wait. Judgment is coming. But I think it's better understood as a positive statement to the faithful. God is telling them to keep trusting him and to remain faithful, knowing that he will judge the sinful nations. But he's still there. It's like the idea in Psalm 33:20, which says, we wait for the Lord. He is our deliverer and shield. So God is encouraging the faithful to continue in faith and to wait patiently while he carries out his judgment on sinful people. And then the rest of the chapter tells us why. Look at verse 9. So at that time, I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that all of them may call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord. From beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshipers, the daughters of my dispersed ones, shall bring me offering. They are to wait in faith because God's judgment will have a good effect. It will have a purifying effect. And so God will give the peoples, he says, a pure speech so they can worship him in unity. There's an allusion here to the events surrounding the Tower of Babel. At that time, at the Tower of Babel, all the people were united, but they were united in disobedience. And God confused their languages, and he scattered the people all over the earth. But now, after God's judgment, God judges the sinful people of all the earth, he will purify speech of all the peoples. In other words, he will unconfuse the speech of the people of the world. This is an undoing of the Babel judgment. and all of the world will have a unified language and will come back together in unity to worship God together. Verse 11. On that day, you shall not be put to shame because of the deeds by which you have rebelled against me. For then I will remove from your midst your proudly exalted ones, and you shall no longer be haughty in my holy mountain, but I will leave in your midst a people humble and lowly. They shall seek refuge in the name of the Lord. Those who are left in Israel shall do no injustice and speak no lies, nor there shall be found in their mouth a deceitful tongue, for they shall graze and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. Jerusalem and Israel will be purified. God will clean out the city by removing the rebellious and arrogant sinners. Only those who humbly seek God and trust in him and are faithful to him will be left. There will no longer be sin. Everything will be right. And everyone will be at ease with nothing to fear. Why? Because everyone will have character like God's. And they will live perfectly in God's ways. If everyone is being obedient to God, there's no reason for anyone to be afraid of anyone. So now, on one hand, this looks forward to Israel returning to the land from exile. But on the other hand, this ultimately looks forward to Jesus' kingdom on earth, when all of this will literally be true. Look at verse 14. Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall never again fear evil. On the day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear not, O Zion. Let not your hands grow weak. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exult over you with loud singing. I will gather those who mourn for the festival so that you will no longer suffer reproach. Behold, at that time I will deal with all your oppressors, and I will save the lame and gather the outcast, and I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. At that time I will bring you in, at that time when I gather you together, for I will make you renowned and praised among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord. So this is reason to celebrate. We just read about all this fearful and this graphic depiction of terrible judgment that is coming on the sinful people of this world. But the godly, the faithful, those who trust in God don't have to be afraid. But they can sing with joy. You see, this is good news. Those who are whose faith is in God have hope and joy, not judgment, in their future. And Zephaniah gives several reasons why God's people should sing and celebrate. First, he says that God will remove all judgment and anything that opposes his people. So there's no more judgment, no more opposition. Secondly, he says the King of Israel, the Lord, will be with them. So God will be with them as their king. Or we could say the Messiah, Jesus, will be with them. And because God is with them, his people will have no need to fear evil ever again. Thirdly, he says that they have no reason for their hands to grow weak. Now, this picture of weak hands is a picture of weak hands that hang down without strength. And it's a picture of people who are in despair and hopelessness. But God's people can be encouraged because he is in their midst. He's with them. Now, why is that exciting? Well, he goes on to explain. I mean, again, they need no fear. There's no need for fear because God is mighty and he will save them and protect them. But it's more than that. You see, God also exults or rejoices over his people. In other words, he celebrates them. He cheers for them. You see, I can't help but picture a parent who's in the stands watching their child compete in some sporting event, and they're cheering for their kid, and they say, "That's my boy. That's my daughter." God cheers for his people. God also loves his people, and he will calm them with his love. He gives them peace. And then he moves on and he talks about when Israel's in exile and they can't worship God through the feast like the Passover because they can't make those sacrifices at the temple. He said, but God's going to regather them in the land. And then lastly, God will deal with all of those who oppress his people and oppose his plan. He will take the initiative and he will come to their aid. And they will never again be weak or looked down upon, but will be restored by God. And they will be praised and looked up to. And this is how Zephaniah ends. This is how his prophecy ends. So after speaking so much about judgment and how terrible that was, he ends with joy by saying we have reason to celebrate. And here's the thing, this is what God does. In my personal Bible reading this week, I was reading in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And there is a very similar statement, a statement that's very similar to Zephaniah, said to God's people in the New Testament. 1 Thessalonians 5, beginning in verse 2, he says, "For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying, 'There is peace and security,' then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for the day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of the day." Skipping down to verse 9, he says, "For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing." You see, if you are a believer in Jesus, for you there is no judgment. There is no hell for you. No being separated from God. But for you there is salvation. God is with you, and he will forever be with you. He is working on your behalf. He loves you, and he celebrates you, and he cheers for you. Do you realize how awesome this is? We have reason to rejoice. We have reason to sing. We have reason to shout to the Lord. Sing to him and celebrate. Praise him and thank him with all your heart. And be encouraged. One day, everything will be right. There will be no injustice. There will be no oppression. And there will be no enemies. Whether those enemies are people, or sickness, or pain, or loss, or death, they will all be gone. Done away with. Jesus is coming back. And he will deal with all of the sin and evil in this world. And so it will be no more. And he will gather his people, and we will be with him forever. And it will be perfect. So be encouraged and sing, or even shout for joy.